Welcome to the Quality and Qualitative Research workshop for the Strategic Management Society annual meeting this year, which is brought to you by the Strategy as Practice interest group and co-sponsored by the Strategy Process interest group. This workshop is organized by Julia and myself, and we're very happy to welcome you to the session today. We have put together a very interesting program for you, which is connected to a special forum on quality in qualitative research, which will be published in the Strategic Organization Journal. And we were launching from there to define the following objectives for this workshop. First, we want to draw attention to the importance of qualitative rigor, as qualitative research has not yet been perceived as equally rigorous as quantitative research everywhere. We also want to provide guideposts as to what good qualitative research looks like, so you know what to do when you engage in qualitative research. And we want to discuss several methods that you can use as qualitative researcher that will suffice these criteria for qualitative research or good qualitative research. So with this, let's have a quick look onto our agenda. We first have our interactive panel with our distinguished scholars, all authors who are part of that special forum that I have mentioned before. We have quick presentations, and then Paula Jarzabkowski, who's the editor of the special forum, will serve as our discussant and engage in an overarching conversation with the authors. We will then have a quick break in your breakout rooms. So we will send you to your roundtable, and there you can socialize the first 10 minutes before you engage in the roundtable discussions, which will last 45 minutes. And then we will bring you back to this main Zoom room for a quick report back and a synthesis of the various topics that you have discussed through the roundtables. Let me quickly introduce to you our distinguished scholars. These are Saturious, Professor of Strategic Management at Warwick Business School, who will be talking about video-based methods. Then we have David Seidel from the University of Zurich, who will be talking about interviewing elites. Then we have Charlotte Cloutier from HEC Montreal and Davide Ravasi from UCL School of Management, talking about using tables in qualitative research. We have Will Harvey from the University of Exeter on candid reporting of fieldwork when access goes wrong. And then we have Hans Berendes on process research methods from the Vrije University Amsterdam. And then, as already mentioned, our discussant and editor of the special forum is Paula Jarzabkowski, sorry about that, who will be talking about hallmarks of qualitative research. And with this short introduction, let's start with our interactive panel. And first we have Saturious on video-based methods.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you this afternoon. Looking forward to our interaction and looking forward to a lot of learning together. In case you're wondering, this is not my spare bedroom. This is our SARD campus in London. And I would like to tackle two key questions. Why should we bother with visuals? Why should we spend time to try and understand visuals? And how could we make the most of this kind of research? Some tips, if you like, that can help us be more effective. Now, many years ago, in 1969, the Apollo 11 moon landings happened, and it was one of the first globally televised events. Many people didn't believe it could happen. By seeing the pictures, seeing the motion picture there, people were able to appreciate that this is possible. This is not just fantasy. And really, the visual made a difference. It made it possible, and people believed. So we use visuals to be able to understand situations that are more complex. And if we go back in the 1940s, further studies have seen in education. If we go to the next here, we see in 1949 there were studies even back looking at not video, but they called them back at the time motion pictures, trying to understand in education what effect do motion pictures have in terms of understanding and comprehension. And there have been a lot of developments, of course, since then. And if we see the reality, the current business reality of organizations, if we go to the next slide, we can see that, of course, the different details we can understand from what is happening in actual organizations. For example, we can focus on particular instances of visuals and artifacts and materials. And there have been a number of great reviews and great special issues recently. I would definitely suggest you go back to the organizational research methods. Curtis and Paula wrote a very interesting special issue and very interesting editorial. So it's a great starting point if you're interested in these ideas. So one way to classify these kinds of materials and visuals and trying to understand them. If we go to the next slide, we can focus either on materials, PowerPoint slides and architectural plans, or if we go to the next focus, we can focus on materials to try and understand how sense making is happening, how sense making, sense giving is taking place, or we can focus on even facial expressions to understand emotions. Another dimension is try to understand how discourse and visuals can be combined in being part of the reality. And of course, another way to appreciate that is, of course, a 2x2 matrix. You just capture a glimpse of the slide a moment ago, a 2x2 matrix, which is a visual that many organizations use. And different iterations of these visuals, these 2x2, of course, consist of SWOT, BCG, and other kinds of iterations of a tool. And managers spend a lot of time creating these kinds of visuals to assist their strategy and strategic thinking. So some tips, of course. This afternoon, we're providing a little bit of recipes, and apologies for the timing of this visual, but in effect, what you're trying to do with your research and your study is combine different ingredients, follow a recipe, a different method, literatures, and combine them to create an outcome, in this case, a lovely cake. And in terms of the visuals, in this instance, what we try and do is think of it in three key steps, for example. First is what kind of data would you like to capture? What kind of insights would you like to collect through this video data? What difference does this video data make? And how would you start comparing and contrasting this visual data? How would you start making comparisons, for example, what you have done versus what others have done, but also how different kinds of data help you find out, getting to find out new creative views of what is happening in your reality. Let me see, do you have, is the audio all right? I don't know if the audio is okay. And of course, if some of you have bandwidth issues, please remove your video in case this doesn't work. So two key question marks I want to highlight. Why and how, and why visuals, because they're helping us see new insights to the reality that we have in front of us, and how, again, using some tips in terms of what you capture, how you capture it, and how does it allow you to create new learnings, new understandings for theory and other studies going into the future. So that's on time my overview of what I wanted to say about visuals. And some further insights. There's a lovely book on open strategy, and that you can help provide some more details around that by David Georg and Richard, and there's a chapter there dealing with some of these topics. And I look forward to our discussions in later on.
Great, thank you very much, Saturious. There is some more insights that you put on the slides that we can share afterwards, maybe with the participants of this workshop. David, you're up next with interviewing elites, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. First of all, you choose a terrible picture of me, so I'm going to go over the allotted time of 8 minutes and do that twice as much time. No, okay, so interviewing elites, if you go to the next slide, I'm talking about interviewing elites because particularly in strategy as practice, we have tended to go particularly for ethnographic methods or ethnographic observations as sort of the method that allows you to get the richest data and so on. But there is also a case for interviewing, and actually we do a lot of interviewing, and I would like to talk about sort of what are the advantages also of interviewing, or just quickly draw attention also to the importance of interviewing, and then particularly about challenges when you interview, when you do interviews, and particularly when you do interview elites, corporate elites, which I'll briefly talk about. So what I'm talking about is also, or the basis of this talk is a paper that I'm working on with Terry McNulty, who has done famous studies with Pettigrew in particular on corporate governance based on interviews, and the paper also with Shenghui Ma, who has been involved in lots of interview studies that I did together with him. So what we are talking in this paper about is sort of what are the particular challenges when you are interviewing elites, and what are practices and research designs that might help you dealing particularly with those challenges that are associated with business elites. So next slide, please. Well, importance of interviewing business elites. What are business elites? Elites are powerful, influential, and high status individuals in the business world. These are the CEOs, the senior executives, the boards of directors. And because they are elites, they have particular characteristics that often make it very challenging to interview them. Yeah, because of those characteristics, they are also particularly interesting to interview them, but the challenges. Maybe let's start off with that. Interviewing is a key approach in many different areas. If you want to understand about corporate governance, upper echelon strategy, organizational change, in all these areas, you have a lot of studies that are based partly purely on interviews with business elites and partly on interviews combined with other methods such as ethnographic observations. What's the advantage of interviewing elites? Interviewing them as compared to doing ethnographic observations or just observations? Well, you often get better at the motivations, assumptions, and meanings through interviews, and often interviews are very useful method to get at actions, interactions of elites when these interactions are dispersed across time and space, and sort of through interviews, it's easier to get access to that. Next slide, please. And now I want to highlight sort of what are particular challenges of interviewing business elites as compared to other actors, other interviewees. One is time constraints. Business elites are particularly constrained for time and their attention. Everybody wants attention. So when you interview them, it's particularly challenging. And here I come back to the quality aspect of all of it. These are all challenges that I refer to that concern the possibility of collecting rich and authentic data. Yeah. So the focus of this is how do you collect rich and authentic data from elites? And the fact that they are time constrained often means that interviews might be cut short. The interviewees, the business elites, might in the interview actually not pay enough attention to the interview questions and so on, not engage very much, and so you get you might not get rich and you might not get very authentic data. Business elites are often very knowledgeable. They often have taken business courses. They know about, they often know about the theories that we have in the background when we ask particular questions and so on. And because they know the theories, they know the concepts and so on, they often tend to be sort of, instead of describing their experiences and what they actually did and why they did certain things, they tend to abstract from their concrete and provide you with sort of more superficial or more theorized or their interpretations rather what actually happened. And if you want to get at what actually happens, it's important to be aware of that. Business elites are often very dominant, and that means they often try to take control of the interview situation and redirect the interview questions from what you had in mind or what you want to get at, because they often think they know better what is good to be asked, and they often maybe don't want to answer questions, so they try to take control in order to direct the interviews to areas that they are interested in. Also, business elites are very visible in the public domain, and because of that, they're used to impression management. They know this is about sort of if they talk about themselves, it might reflect back on them. They also, in interviews, when they answer, depending on how their quotes are being used, because they are so visible in the public domain, they are particularly careful and provide more superficial answers. So how do you deal with that? And maybe next slide. Well, one way of dealing with that is sort of through research design, the different research designs when you do interview-based studies and purely interview-based studies. And these, and here we have looking at and going through sort of all the big studies on business elites. There are sort of 4 types of core studies. These studies could be individual-based around the individual elite, or firm-based. You want to understand the firm and you have interviews with these elites, or they can be serial or one-off. So you might interview the same business elite over time or just one-off. And that has implications on how well you can manage these challenges. Maybe next slide, and I skipped the next slide, and that's something that we might talk about in the roundtables. I'm also conscious of time, so maybe we go to the next one. These are interview practices, and we picked out 4 interview practices that might help particularly to deal with these 4 constraints that I talked about. The first one, time constraint. The business elites might not pay enough attention to, they might not give enough time and attention to your interview questions. One of the things that we found in our own experience that is not really talked so much about in the literature is sort of creating the interview experience for the interviewee as a worthwhile experience, as a way of reflecting also about the work, and sort of in that way also get engaged and have it as an engaged and interesting discussion. And if they feel engaged, if they feel it's a worthwhile experience, they might grant you more time, they might engage more, pay more attention to your questions. Establishing researcher trust and credibility might help with impression management. If they trust you, if they see that you are trustworthy, credible, that you have empathy, they open up much more than if they're not. And if you do serial interviews, for example, over time, you manage also much more to, if you do that, you might manage much more to get their trust and be seen as trustworthy. Flexibly using a fixed interview structure. I mean, we do have semi-structured interview grids and so on. But when you talk to elites who tend to dominate, you might use them not only to sort of keep yourself on track, but you might use those to keep control of the interview situation. You might always come back and say, well, I have my interview grid or whatever, and I come back to that, and in that sense, rein them back in. And finally, leveraging public information. I mean, one of the advantages of elites is that they are very much in the public domain. So you have a lot of information about them. And by preparing properly and getting those information, you have an advantage that in the concrete interview situation, when you ask the questions, you can come back to concrete instances that have been reported about. And in that way, you can sort of bring them down from sort of an abstract discussion about sort of what they think into concrete experiences, concrete instances. And that way, maybe also overcome sort of the problem that they know about theories and might start theorizing, or you all can also overcome the impression management and then talk sort of try to present a sort of a superficial image or a superficial presentation and bring them down into the concrete instance or concrete experience, and in that way sort of get more rich and authentic data. I think my time is almost up, so I think I leave it at that, and in the roundtable discussions we can dive deeper into the implications of different research designs and different interview practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this very insightful presentation. Now we have Charlotte and Davide about using tables.
Okay, hello everyone. So thank you for inviting us. I guess we can just jump right in, and Davide and I will be going back and forth. We'll be sharing this presentation. So before we even talk about tables, we thought it would be helpful and make sense to talk about the elephant in the room around tables. And this is about these misconceptions that we often have about tables. One of them being that they tend to be attached to particular research methodologies. One that comes to mind is the popularity of the JOA method, which is an approach or a template that encourages the use of tables, when in fact there's no reason to assume that the use of tables is relegated to a particular method. There's also a tendency to associate tables with a positivist research orientation. This is largely due to tables being associated with Miles and Huberman, who were the first to suggest the use of tables for analytical purposes. And they quite clearly were positivist in their orientation, but here again, that's an assumption that we make that really doesn't have any foundations. In fact, we can use tables for any kind of research, regardless of our approach or research position. And another misconception that we see a lot is about how tables serve only display purposes. Today, we're going to not necessarily refer only to that, but we'll get a chance to discuss how they can be used for other purposes. Next slide for Davide.
Yes, so what we did, we went through the last 2-3 years of some of the most prominent management journals, and we identified 12 types of tables that are more common or more, to our judgment at least, interesting and useful. And we noticed how some of these tables tend to be typically in different parts of the papers, even though some may not necessarily appear in the end. And they tend to perform, some can be useful for organizing your data in a preliminary phase, keeping track of all your sources, all your data items. Some may be useful to analyze data, detecting, tracing patterns, sequences, similarities, differences, co-occurrences. And some may be useful especially to display. And actually, many of these tables, as you can see from this table, can actually be used for many functions, many purposes. And what we did in the paper was not only illustrating these various tables and the variations that they can have, but also showing how each of these tables can contribute in different ways to establish the trustworthiness of the research process.
Next slide. And so given that this particular interactive panel is about trustworthiness, we decided to focus a little bit on showing how tables can be useful for showing and demonstrating trustworthiness of qualitative research. In the roundtables, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about how to use tables for both organizing and display purposes. So the approach to, like, a general definition of trustworthiness that we're using is the one proposed or outlined in Pratt, Kaplan, Whittington, the article that the commentary that was in ASQ, about the degree to which the reader can assess whether the researchers have been honest in how the research has been carried out and reasonable in the conclusions they make. And our sense is that tables are helpful in this way in two regards. One is about contributing to ensuring trustworthiness in the research process in terms of what we've done, and then contributing to building trust in the actual findings, the conclusions that we draw. Next slide. So we'll give you some examples. We of the 12, we've selected 4 here to show you quickly, and then in the paper we outline many more types of tables and their usefulness for showing trustworthiness. So a data sources table is probably one of the most common tables that you'll find in qualitative research. Some papers that only have 1 table will have this one. It's a useful table in 2 regards. One is it helps readers assess the methodology and approach that the authors have used, the types of data that they collected, how much data they collected, and the use that they had in their analysis. So it shows this, but it also analytically is useful to sort of keep the readers aware of what data they are using to draw which conclusions, and are they actually using all of their data. So next, click. And so in terms of the research process, it helps researchers ensure they've collected all the data of their evolving study design, that they've not misplaced any data, that they haven't not looked at certain pieces of data, and it facilitates the establishment of a study audit trail. So another example of a table, next slide, is a coding scheme, which is another table that can be helpful for readers to assess, and even for readers themselves or authors themselves to be disciplined in their coding approach and the evidence that they show or provide to back their claims and back the labels that they identifies or categories they identified. This is also a variation on a concept evidence table. And this table, click, is useful as well for showing trust in the research process by ensuring the coding has been based on clearly stipulated criteria. Oftentimes when we look at these tables, there are labels, but no explanations or definitions of what they are. And then they're also helpful for robustness in the findings by demonstrating the rigor of the coding process, and enables readers to independently assess if the displayed evidence adequately represents the stated criteria. So it helps the reader see the connections that the authors have made.
So when you look at the findings, at the findings section of a paper, often you find what we call temporally ordered table or typologically ordered table. Qualitative research is about finding similarities and differences across cases, or about finding temporal patterns, temporal sequences. When it comes to temporally ordered tables, you can find 2 types of tables. Some are follow a concept of time that has been referred to as clock time. So they show you how things changed on a day-by-day basis, or how they change over precise temporal intervals, while others reflect more a concept of time that is an epochal time, a time that is demarcated by events, phases, stages. This is an example of a table that shows clearly how certain important analytical categories, in this case, the fidelity and the extensiveness of the way in which a practice was implemented in an organization, changed from one phase to the next. They explain how it changed, and they summarize the observation, and they show some evidence. And so you can consider this some sort of findings in a nutshell. Another label that we could have for this table is a narrative summary, is a way to help you think the process through and show to your readers how the various phases of the process manifested. So how the fundamental concept in your model manifested in different phases of the process. Click, I like this idea of click. So in this sense, these type of tables help you systematically track how things change empirically and theoretically from one phase to the next when you're producing, developing, or narrating a grounded model. But they also help your readers see more clearly the empirical observations that back your analysis and that lead to this process theorizing. Click. Finally, this is a table that I find extremely useful, because sometimes qualitative research produces relatively complex theoretical frameworks, and I found these theoretical summaries, tables that have only theoretical content. Essentially, it's a comparative summary of your observations across cases, or a summary of the various elements that compose your models. there's no empirical references here. There's no data. It's just an articulation of the content of all the elements of a model, in this case, with references to the particular tables or figures that display evidence for these theoretical observations. So I find this extremely useful to make sure that there's a complete theorizing of all your emerging theoretical frameworks, be it based on a process model, comparative case study, any kind of qualitative research, may be explained more clearly, the theoretical insights can be explained more clearly using a table like this. We have many others, and we have some tips, but to hear those, you have to participate to the roundtable discussion we're going to have.
Great, thank you very much, Charlotte and Davide. And now let's swiftly move on to Will. And when access goes wrong, candid reporting of fieldwork.
Great, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm going to give you a couple of vignettes from my PhD research some years ago and one of my postdoctoral research projects. So I've conducted a lot of interviews over the last 15 years across multiple different countries and various research projects. I've listed some of them at the top of this slide. And the first vignette I really wanted to share with you is when I was doing my PhD in Boston, Massachusetts, on the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sector. And I remember it's probably about my 5th or 6th interview, and I was interviewing the chief executive of a pharmaceutical company. And I was about 5 minutes into the interview, and he said, look, well, can I just stop you here? What kind of questions are these? And this really threw me. I was not prepared for this. I'd already done pilot interviews, as I said, already done several other interviews. And this was a really poignant moment for me to really reflect on trying to justify and understand from a practitioner lens or an interviewee lens, you know, what's the value of each question? What am I trying to get at with each question? And so that was a really important kind of lesson for me, but it was a hard lesson, I have to say. David pointed out some important points around interviewing elites, which is something I've done a lot of. I think one aspect which came out in the chat as well is thinking about your positionality in the field. And what I mean by that is, how is your experience, your social characteristics, how does that map on to the interviewee? Now, of course, in a face-to-face interview context, that can sometimes be easier. Sometimes you've got visual cues about the person, but also the setting of the interview itself. But obviously when one's doing it remotely, we're a bit more limited. But I would just urge all of you to think about that positionality. I gave a reference to Linda McDowell in the chat, because she wrote a really good article about her position in the field when she, as a female professor at Oxford, was interviewing elites, and predominantly male elites, in the financial sector of the City of London. And she talks about how she changes her position very quickly depending upon cues that she picked up early on in the interview. So I'd really recommend you think about that. But another kind of tip is try and end your interviews well. And so ending well, in my experience, is about, one, just ensuring that the interviewee has an opportunity to provide questions or to give some reflections, him or herself. Two, telling them about the next steps in terms of the project. And three, just the follow-up. And Laura Empson wrote an article a couple of years ago on elites, and she said that when she interviewed elites, a lot of them were quite damning about their experience of being interviewed by academics, including from business schools. And I find it amazing how few people actually have the courtesy to follow up with people afterwards to actually provide an update on the project. I think that's the least we can do when we're asking for their time. So I've got lots of examples of challenges I've had. What I really wanted to kind of share with you is, despite lots of challenges during my PhD with various different types of interview, you know, the silver lining, I suppose, was I managed to publish out of that still. And a shameless flag, the bottom right image is a screenshot of an article I wrote on interviewing elites in Qualitative Research, the journal. I was just looking on Google Scholar. It's been cited 675 times now. And so I think there was something about that article that really resonated with people across the social sciences and in medical science as well, around the challenges of interviewing elites. So check it out if it's useful. Next slide, please. Next slide, if that's okay. Thank you. The second example I wanted to finish with is a project that I was doing during my second postdoc in Oxford on a large management consulting firm. And this was a global project trying to understand the reputation and the management of reputation of this organization. And what the table at the top is showing is 3 different stages of challenges. So if you focus on the second column, so the first stage, I, as the principal investigator, had a lot of problems with the non-disclosure agreement. And there was lots of backwards and forwards between the Oxford legal team and the management consulting legal team. And this went on for months. And why I'm saying that is because not only did it have an impact on the time horizon of the project, but actually it had relational implications as well. And so just to kind of bear in mind that once one gains access, we often think of it as somehow opening a door and you enter into that door. But actually, I think the way you enter the field can actually have an impact on the trajectory of the field work. And then we had a lot of issues in terms of gaining access to people within the management consulting firm. We were conducting interviews all over the world. And the problem particularly that I found was we had a particular gatekeeper who was very keen to recommend particular people that we should speak to. And that's great in terms of getting access. Practically, it's very useful. But of course, if you're getting a gatekeeper shaping or giving a very particular direction of who you speak to, then clearly we know as independent researchers that that might not be the whole picture of what's going on in the firm. And so without going into details, that was very challenging, both with accessing consultants, clients, competitors, and a whole range of other stakeholders. And then the third point I wanted to make on this was that initially this project was set out as a case study, multi-method, interviews, non-participant observations, online survey, secondary sources, a few other things as well. And this was agreed in the non-disclosure agreement. But towards the end of the field work, for reasons that the firm was potentially going through a merger and acquisition where one of the big 4 accounting firms was going to buy them out, the senior partner said that we could not conduct the online survey. And so that was just a massive bombshell moment in terms of the project, because that completely undermined the whole sort of design of the project. Anyhow, but I managed to keep a good professional relationship with them despite the challenges, and didn't burn any bridges, and ultimately managed to conduct another 20 to 25 interviews and collect other types of data. So despite what seemed like an insurmountable mountain to overcome during that field work, we managed to kind of complete the field work, maintain positive relationships. And I couldn't help sharing a kind of photograph at the bottom right, which was a publication that came out of the project in Human Relations, which not only won an award, but we actually got a trophy. I mean, who gets a trophy nowadays for an academic paper? But anyway, it was a wonderful dinner not far from where Paula works in the City of London at the Armourers Hall. So that was a really nice kind of sweet kind of ending to the project. But the final point I wanted to make, because I think I'm out of time, is that there are lots of examples, I think, of the journey that we go on in terms of the data collection. But I guess what I wanted to say, that the backstage of how we collect the data is often much more messy than the clean front stage of what we read in methodological sections of empirical papers. But the good news is that we can be transparent around what happened in the field, but we don't necessarily also have to say everything about the warts and all and the trials and tribulations of everything that we face in the field. So on that positive note, I'll hand the baton over.
Great. Thank you very much, Will, for this uplifting talk, especially to our junior scholars. Now let's continue to Hans and process research methods.
Thank you. Well, first, Christina, Julia, thank you for organizing this session so well. So my talk will be focused on process research methods, and in particular on writing it up. I've been teaching a course on process research methods now for a couple of years for PhDs, and this is an issue that keeps getting back as something that they struggle with, and that I myself I'm also struggling with. So therefore, we wanted to explore that a bit further, because there's actually quite not much guidance on writing process research for a journal. So basically, for process research, you want to have a very tight connection between your process data and process theory. So a process theory aims to explain how phenomena develop, change, emerge, terminate over time. And typically it needs to be supported by process data. So data on how, in specific cases, projects, firms, whatever, these phenomena have developed over time. So your data will be temporarily structured. So for me, the key characteristic of high quality process research is this tight connection between the data and your process theory, so that the process data provides support for your theory, whereas the theory explains the data and explains how things have developed. And a very nice example of that, for instance, is the paper by Sarah Kaplan and Wanda Orlikowski, Temporal Work in Strategy Making, where they investigated 5 projects, and they offer 5 diagrams in which they show how the empirics of those 5 cases, how the dynamics over time map upon the theoretical model. So making that connection between theory and data very explicit. Another example is actually by in the recent paper by Charlotte and Davide on identity trajectories, where they do it by means of tables. These temporary tables that they refer to can also be a great way of showing how the timeline with theoretical interpretation of that timeline supports and a theoretical process model. Now, that's the aim, but how to write it up? That's the question that we were after here, because if you have process data, you have this rich case that you've been tracing for maybe 1-2 years, you have this massive chunk that you want to tell, that you can't just cut up in pieces as you could do with other types of qualitative data. So how are you going to tell it? And basically we see 2 approaches to that. The approach that I see most qualitative researchers and especially younger qualitative researchers take is a very inductive approach, almost like a detective. And the illustration I have here is Agatha Christie with Murder on the Orient Express, who writes the story like a detective, where the answer to the question that she posed is at the very last page of her book. Dan said, Poirot, having placed my solution before you, I have the honor to retire from the case. So when we follow this example as qualitative researchers, you are laying out, the bits and pieces, the story of the case that you followed, the multiple cases, to provide the answers, the theoretical interpretations towards the end. The alternative is Gabriel Garcia Marquez with Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Instead of taking the detective approach, he provides the answer in the very first sentence. First page is, on the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nazar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat the bishop was coming on. So it's already clear who will be killed, who will be doing the killing. The question is, why? Basic argument of the essay that Fleur Dakin and me wrote is we need a bit more of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and a bit less of Agatha Christie in our writing on process and methods. So what does this imply practically? If we go to the next slide, we have these 3 main elements of a good qualitative process study. You have the empirical narratives, you have conceptualizations, you have your concepts that you will be using to interpret it, culminating typically in a model process theory. But how to sequence those elements, narrative, the concepts, and the model. We are often inclined to start first with the narrative because we want to let the reader follow the story as we encountered it ourselves, and we have immersed ourselves in all of its richness. So we tend to write first the narrative, then the concepts to interpret it, and then provide a model. I've applied that myself, and I see other scholars apply it, but the reaction that we often get then is, why am I reading all of this? You may have witnessed this extremely interesting case where every detail matters for you because you know the case. But for a reader who doesn't know where the story is going, who doesn't know what theoretical point you want to make with your story, this is a difficult one to approach. So yes, you can take this approach of first presenting narratives, then concepts, and then a model, but only if it is very clear from the very first page where you will be going, what the ultimate theoretical contribution is. In the essay, we give examples. One example here is Martha Feldman's paper on routines, the 2000 paper. A paper where her findings are presented first from the narrative, then towards conceptualization, then towards a model. But at the very first page of the paper, she already says that her main insight is that she thought that routines were stable, but that she uncovered in her study that routines were changing every time they were enacted. So it's clear, like with Gabriel Garcia Marquez on the very first page, what's the main message? Now, a second option that we labeled conceptualized composition is to first introduce your concepts and only then the narrative. And then after that, a model. A nice example here is the study by Charlotte Coutier and David Ravasi that I mentioned before, where they first developed the concepts and then use the concepts to give a theoretical telling of the narratives, of the rich histories of the cases. So the cases are told with accompanying theoretical interpretation, only then to provide a model. Third option is a model-led composition, where you actually start with your concepts and your model. And this is a bit counterintuitive for qualitative researchers, and especially when you did the study inductively. So the model is the final outcome of your research, but it may help to present it at first. So if you click and show the last option, if you present the model up front, you provide a kind of a guiding framework, as if you provide a map for your findings. One example is a paper by David Seidel and Felix Werle, where they also explain it along those lines. Be aware that the model was developed inductively, but we show it up front in order to interpret the case narrative, so that readers do not have to wonder why they are reading all of that, but that is clear. The pitfall there is that it may all seem pre-cooked. So you have to explain very well that it has the model was developed inductively, and also make sure that you have the solid evidence to back up your theoretical interpretations. For instance, using tables like Charlotte and Davide explained. So in the essay, we further develop these three approaches, give examples, give their the pitfalls and the ways to make them work. And I'd be happy to talk further about that in the breakout.
Great, thank you very much, Hans. There will be plenty of opportunity to talk about those in the roundtable. But before we break into those, let's hear Paula Jarzabkowski, who was editing the special forum and her hallmarks of quality and qualitative research.
Okay, so actually I understood that I was going to introduce the special issue. And I'd just like to give a plug for that. There's been some, I think one of the things that's very interesting of late is that we've come to understand that quality in qualitative research could have got a little bit boxed. You know, there was a lot of efforts for people in earlier stages to set up qualitative research in journals that were less used to it, less clear on what were the hallmarks of quality. And so they tended to run that by the sort of the diktats of what had been quality in quantitative research, you know, so issues to do with reliability, replicability, you know, can you replicate this? And of course, these are things that we way want out of studies that have relatively few variables and have, you know, established the relationships through those variables deductively in advance. And so in efforts to sometimes get this kind of research into those journals when people didn't really know what qualitative research was, we might have got ourselves a little bit boxed up as well in terms of talking about, I used the such and such method, you know, so there was the Eisenhart method for a period of time, and that was seen as the big thing. And I mean, someone's done this most amazing stats on, you know, how many papers in a period of time cited the Eisenhart method at the start of their research methods as a sort of indicator of, well, that's quality. And that method was typically, you know, that I would have matched pairs of cases. Since then, it's been, well, I use the Joya method, and a lot of people have taken that to mean, well, I have that bubble chart that shows how I went from first to second to third types of concepts. And really, what are the things, and of course, you know, there was always been that little bit of a thing of, well, how do you know this is reliable? But of course, reliability measures are typically come from a different tradition in science. We're actually interested in the validity and the trustworthiness of your data. Its reliability, it may not be reliable from case to case. Cases are different, situations are different. So in that sense, one of the things about us wanting to do this special issue on qualitative research was to offer the opportunity to go beyond the templates that we may have got ourselves boxed into in our efforts to try and get this work into journals. But now we have a lot of qualitative research in journals, a lot of great qualitative research in journals. And so I think it's important that we now don't start to lose the thing that is the hallmark of quality in qualitative research, which is an authentically told tale that you can trust, and you can trust it because it's grounded in the experiences of the researcher. You know, you can trust that that researcher has immersed themselves, and that the way they want to interpret those findings to you are robust in so much as it's an immersive interpretation of their own, that they have reasons for believing or wishing to present to you in this way, and that they can connect that to theory in order to make some extension to existing theory. So we need to trust the researcher. And of course, there are ways that we can better trust the researcher to bring their interpretations to us. And that's some of what we're seeing here through the people's presentations today. And also we need to be quite open to different ways of trusting that researcher. I'm not going to trust a researcher more as an editor or an author more as an editor because they've done a bubble chart. I'm not going to trust them because they say they use the Eisenhart method. I'm not going to trust them more because they say it was reliable because I had 3 other people code the data. I'm going to trust them because their story is plausible, because when they say this is the concept that I think that these data illustrate, I think that's plausible. That seems a really interesting insight into that concept. So I'm looking for interest. I'm looking for plausibility. And of course, I'm looking for that plausibility and interest to then take theory somewhere I could not have gone without that person's interpretations. And what we have here in front of us today, and I don't want to spend too long on this, but because I want us to get down to these great panelists. So what we have in front of us and what we're doing in this special issue is inviting people who've had a lot of experience in this to show how they go about quality and qualitative research. What are the things that they do in the conduct of the research? And so we have things like David, for example, talking about you know, the interviewing process. What are the types of materials that might give you new insights? And we've got stuff from, you know, Saturious about the visuals, but then we've also got things from, say, Davide and Charlotte about how you actually present that in ways that can back up or provide support to your immersive experience and your interpretations. We've got things from Will about how you actually do the research project, how you regroup from what is a very authentic experience in the field, how you regroup and understand that and still provide something that can be sort of challenging of existing theory. And I think, you know, from Hans, we have an interesting set of insights about, you know, if you have data that are longitudinal, that have a story to tell over time, there are different ways of rendering that plausible, which can be a linear journey from start to end, and you reveal it at the end, but is that a good way to do that? Are there ways that you can move back and forth? So we've got some really great insights from our speakers here. I think one of the other things I should probably just briefly talk about is, so we are also going to have a couple of other papers in the special issue, people who couldn't be with us today, but I think it's that I'd like to mention them as well. So we've also got actually Kathleen Eisenhart in the special issue. She'll be talking about the Eisenhart method in her paper, how it was to do that as a young doctoral, you know, just straight out of her doctorate, not yet tenured, to try and write qualitative research, and then to write something that justified why qualitative research was valid, and then how that method's developed or been used by others since, and how she might revisit it were she to write that paper again today. We also have a nice paper on capturing emotions, you know, some of what we haven't dealt with here, but one of the things we're all aware of, and it is part of your immersive experience when you're doing qualitative research, is you become aware of people's emotions. People express anger, frustration, humor during qualitative research, and often that gets pushed to the background. But we have a lovely paper by Saori Kuami and Feng Liu on capturing emotions and using emotions to get more authenticity. And we have a paper by Kevin Corley, Tima Bansal, and Haitao Yu, in which Kevin and Tima reflect on their experiences as editors at AMJ and at leading journals of what they look for to trust a paper. So I think that we've got a really exciting journal coming, you know, special issue coming up with some great papers. But what I really think we should be doing right now is going to these panelists, if they would all, if we could stop sharing the slides, if they would all show their beautiful faces on screen. And we've got some good, tough questions here. Some of the questions, and thank you, there's a load of great questions. So it'd be really good if we could save all that chat to circulate later, because I think, and also some of them are questions that are more suited to the roundtables because they're quite specific technical details. But there's one question I'm going to ask all of you to address and give us a short, because I think let's stick to the topic, which is quality and qualitative research. And we've had a questioner, what are the first things you look for that make you trust a qualitative paper, and what makes you immediately question a qualitative paper? And I'd actually just like each of our panelists to reflect on that from their own experience, maybe from the lens you're presenting to us in terms of the visuals or the process or the elites, but it's what makes you trust, you know, what is something that you think, I trust this paper, when you read it as a reviewer, as an editor, as a, you know, supervisor of a doctoral student, or what raises a red flag to you? So shall I go in the order of which you spoke, or would one of you just like to stick your hand up?
Or I'm happy to give everyone a bit more time.
Go on then, Will. You just jump in there and let them all think about their answers. Thanks, Will. No problem.
Yeah, I mentioned in the chat one area that and I'm reflecting because I was reviewing a paper 2 days ago in one of the Academy journals, and it's where you get very generic kinds of commentary in the methods section for me that kind of gets the shackles up. So often I ask myself when I'm reading some of these general types of statements, well, isn't that true of many, many qualitative papers that we read? So I guess that the more broad you are, the less convinced I am. When you can be really specific around the details of what the data you've collected, how you collected it, the time frame, the types of people, the data analysis, which Davide and Charlotte obviously talked about. When you start getting very specific around your study, that gives me much greater confidence that it's been kind of, it's gone through a process of kind of informal review, it's been thought through in a more detailed way. So that's kind of the area that I look for quite carefully in empirical papers.
Thanks for that, Will. And I think, you know, that's a really helpful point. It's not, you know, I did abductive and I did inductive and I did axial coding. It's, I did this with my data. I called that concept that because this is how I identified it in the data, is I think what you're saying. And I fully agree with that as an editor. But who else would like to stick their hand up? Yes, thank you, hands.
Yeah, so for me, after reading the introduction, I would immediately go to the part after the references to see what are the figures, what are the tables that are in, because figures, they really help to clarify thinking. And if there's a clear figure, this indicates some clear thinking. And then the data, the tables, they show what evidence is there and how is the evidence linked to the concepts. That if that's there, then I will go and read the paper from the front to the back with much more confidence. And otherwise, they might be already at a disadvantage.
So you see what I mean? Hans is a process guy from the start, right? He goes to the front and then he goes to the back before he goes back to the front. So, you know, I think that's useful. David, you wanted to respond to
maybe
Hans,
just coming up on, so you would go straight to the figures. What about if there are no figures? And I often have this discussion with Martha Feldman. She says, let's leave the figures out. I mean, this is simplification and so on. Let's not have figures. So you would say, okay, that's not worth reading.
No, it can be tables as well. But when there's no figure, no tables, or only a single table with how many interviews have been done, I get a bit suspicious indeed. Of course, you can have different styles of theorizing, but I like this very tight connection between theory and your data. And I think you need to have tables and figures help.
Yeah. So I'm going to I can see Davide and Charlotte.
No, but I continue. That was just my start.
Okay, you can do that. I was just going to let them respond on tables, but you go first.
Oh, I see. I thought you thought that was already my input. And okay, now let the others then come in.
I'll let Davide respond to that because I was going to add something else. So let's jump into. You wanted us to comment on how tables are useful for showing quality.
Well, no, it's just because Hans said that if he doesn't see a table, he's very suspicious. I thought Davide or you might have something to say there. Like, is this spurious science making? Well, if you have a table, you have science, or is it something more than that?
No, but so I don't see any problem if it's an ethnography and there are no tables. That's okay. But if you're declaring that you coded your data, and then you don't show me, you don't even tell me what these codes are, you don't show me evidence, examples, anything, you just say you've been coding, but then after that there's no disclosure of any evidence that you actually did, that to me is suspicious. What makes me not trust the paper is when I see these kind of inconsistencies. You declare you did something, but then you're not showing it, or that doesn't seem to have any impact on the findings that you're reporting. So it looks like as if you're telling me that you did certain things because you think that I want to see those things, but actually you didn't do them. And that becomes clear once you start talking about your findings, and that obviously undermines the credibility of the paper, in my view.
Yeah, and I would add to that because the point I wanted to make was that a red flag for me when I read a paper are these inconsistencies between what they're saying in one end of the paper and then showing in other parts of the paper. So whether you show it through tables are just a very useful way to do that, not only in terms of showing, but also in terms of going through the rigor of analyzing the data in a systematic way. It's kind of like a checklist or something you can use. Even if you don't actually show it in your paper, there's a discipline involved in generating tables that helps you think. And so for me, a red flag is those inconsistencies between what the person claims and then what they show.
So should I then come in?
Please do,
for me,
David.
I mean, I would say the key thing for a qualitative paper is do I have the feeling that there is rich and authentic data? And for me, it's often difficult to say how you see that. I would say I feel that. Maybe it fits with the qualitative part. No, but you feel like the data is rich. It's authentic. The tables help with that also because a lot of the complexity in the data and so on also can be brought in through the tables, but also in the way things are described. You see, sort of, that's rich, that's authentic. And the second thing that is a little bit related to that, initially might not look related to that, is do I feel the theoretical perspective is forced onto the data? Or does the data and the theoretical perspective speak to each other? Yeah, and it's often, and maybe that's also what you often hear when you now put in a paper, they say, well, I don't see the messiness, it's too clean. Actually, what it means is actually, you don't really see the reality in there. It seems like your data, it might be a sign that you are sort of forcing your theory onto the data, or also that you don't have such rich data, that you have the messiness around it. At the same time, I'm also troubled by the messiness. I often hate this, make it more messy. And I often get this, I have a very German clear-cut mind, so I'm trying to sort of get out the messiness and sort of get down to the structures and so on. But I can see sort of the messiness also shows you and signals sort of the kind of data you have. Yeah, and so I would say I often feel sort of, I mean, what you said there, what Charlotte also raised and David there about sort of inconsistencies and so on. Often I feel at the beginning of when a paper is first submitted, there are often a lot of inconsistencies because people have not worked out things and so on. That's problematic, but these might be things that you might sort out in the review process. But at the beginning, particularly when it's about papers that are coming in and you have to decide or you have to suggest whether the paper should be carried on or not, I would say it's important, do you feel there is richness and authenticity in the data, and so that you can actually do something with it, even if the paper at the stage at which you receive it and read it is not properly done yet.
Okay, Saturious.
Yes, related to my point about cakes earlier and following the recipe, probably you've seen some of the programs, Bake Off, and reviewers and editors have eaten a lot of cake before. And you're providing your cake, your cheesecake, whatever cake you have decided to cook. And it needs to follow a recipe, obviously, like other people have followed. But sometimes it's nice to do something different as well. You have to follow the recipe, but sometimes putting a spin there, adding some chocolate, adding some salt here, you know, some extra ingredient helps, but it needs to kind of follow and be done in a correct way. So think what makes you distinctive compared to all the other cakes that the reviewers and editors have eaten. And yes, Will talks about experimenting. So what I want to say is that try and do practice before you send it off to be judged. So find forums like this one, great forums in conferences, refine as much as you can, as I mentioned in the comments. So when it is sent out to be eaten, it looks quite in a good shape, and you have balanced out the ingredients nicely and you have followed the recipe.
I'm sensing a real theme from Saturious. It's afternoon tea time. You notice his visuals, a lot of cakes. And now you notice his explanation, a lot of cakes. Metaphorical reasoning here at afternoon tea time. You're making me hungry. Thanks. David, I think you had your hand raised, so maybe you make the last comment and then I'll just sum up. Oh,
thank you. Now, just building on what David was saying about the richness and the authenticity. To me, it's very important to see precision, detail. Don't just talk about an informant. Just tell us more about who this person was. Don't talk about generic decisions. Tell us something more about what was at stake, what was decision about. In general, often you have these papers that are relatively light on detail. You know, Hans earlier mentioned reading these papers where there's a lot of information and you're not sure why is this information there. That's an extreme, but and you want to avoid that too. But at the other end, you often have these papers that are very generic about what they talk about, very superficial. And then you're questioning whether they really know what they talk about. In the end, I think that reviewers want to have the impression that you know your topic, that you're deeply familiar with your setting, that you know what you're talking about when you're proposing a certain interpretation of your. And in this sense, being precise, detail, facts, figures, context is something that goes a long way in gaining the trust of the reviewers.
So thank you. We could actually discuss this for a long time, but we don't have a long time. Just to sum up, I endorse everything that was said by my colleagues. I mean, these are great authors. I've loved their work. I've worked with some of them, and I also believe everything that was just said. I guess in terms of the, just the final thing I'd probably say is, if your data are good, yeah, you've got an interesting, good data set, and if you tell that story well the first time, I may think when I get a first submission, I like this story. It's an interesting story. You may not yet know what it is a story of, and that is a very common thing, that the one-to-one correspondence with what's the right theory, that's the hook for this story. But if I think it's a good story with good data, we can work with that. You know, we can find what it is a story of or a case of. So in that sense, I'd always go for that little bit more mess in that first story. Let them see what you've got, because that's what you've got to work with through the review process. And I guess the other thing that I'd say about that is the story that you see in a paper has been written many, many times. I would never send a paper in that I hadn't written the story at least 13 or 14 times. Then I get an R&R, and the main thing, once I know what it is a story of, is trying to make sure that the story shows that it is a story of that. So when you see our stories in papers and you think, look at that, they knew how to get that cleanness and messiness just right. Well, actually, it was a lot of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It was too big, and then it was too small, it was too soft, and then it was too hard, it was too hot, and then it was too cold before we got it just right. So be kind to yourself. If you are taking a lot of times to write your story to get it just right, well, in that case, you're in good company if you think I'm good company, because that's what I do. And I'm pretty much sure everyone that's on this panel does that too. We're going to actually stop now and move into roundtables. You had a lot of specific questions in the chat. I've just saved the chat. I think we can possibly save the chat. The host in each roundtable could save the chat there, maybe even try recording, let's see. But let's save all the chat. Christina, shall I hand back to you to just remind people what they've got to do?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I will actually hand over for this to Julia, because she will introduce the second part. But first of all, let me thank you all for this fantastic first part. Our interactive panel, it has been very insightful. So thank you to you, Paula, for hosting it or facilitating it, and all our fantastic authors and their papers. And congratulations again for having been selected for the special forum. We're all looking forward to the special issue. And with this, we will go to part 2, and I will hand over to Julia.
Thank you, Christina, and also from my side, thank you to everybody. Before we proceed, we just wanted to say thank you to the distinguished callers, because our recording will stop now because roundtables won't be recorded.